that the movement stop really being about abolishing economic coercion that causes these ideologies to be necessary and starts keeping along with these ideological lines. You start to see exactly what you're referencing here. And I think what you'll probably be able to explain to us, Caleb.
Right. How is the synthetic left weaponizing this history that they're kind of veiling against materialist communists?
A lot of what we're hearing from the synthetic left, honestly, is just the result of a class difference when it really gets down to it. A lot of it is just the synthetic left. BreadTube is very suburban, right? It's very, very suburban. You know, Vosh is from Beverly Hills, right? And if you look at the origin of these people, you know, Northern Virginia, that's where ContraPoints is from. That's, you know, the suburbs of DC, where a lot of very well-paid.
Langley is also in Virginia too.
There's that too. But these are not people who grew up in trailers, right? These are not people who have relatives who are in the military, or at least not the lower ranks of the military. They're from the upper layers of U.S. society, the layers of U.S. society that live very comfortably. Yeah, these are not people who have relatives in prison, for example, right? And that one thing that is just a true thing wherever you go in the world is that life is much more authoritarian for working class people. Right?
Absolutely.
Go to the schools in working class neighborhoods, in an urban area or in a rural area. Yeah, and compare it to a school in a wealthy suburb. You know, in a school in a wealthy suburb, you might not even have to ask permission to go to the bathroom. You might be able to call your teacher by their first name rather than Mrs. or Mr., you know?
Right.
We don't believe in that kind of authority here. Yeah. Not at this school.
Right. And it's a much more kind of relaxed, you know, comforting, tolerant environment. And that's probably healthier, honestly, right? It's better to raise kids.
Absolutely.
But if you go to a low income, you know, more working class school in an urban area or in a rural area, things are going to be a lot different. You know what I mean? They're going to be a lot more conservative. One thing I've often mentioned that people have no idea about, if you didn't grow up around this, you would have no idea. But in 19 U.S. states, corporal punishment is still legal in public schools.
Right. Wow.
Teachers in public schools can spank their students, right?
I thought it was less states. I knew that there were still states, but I didn't realize it was that many.
Yeah, and if you go to like rural Alabama, rural Texas, areas where you have a lot of low-income people, both black and white, it's very possible that there's going to be corporal punishment in your school, right? And, you know, working-class parents tend to be a little more authoritarian with their kids, and that, you know, if you have relatives who are in prison, if you have relatives who are in the military, you're going to have a lot more of an authoritarian upbringing.
100%.
And a lot of it might come from necessity, honestly. If the parent is struggling to pay the bills, I've heard this analogy made before, but, you know, if it's a low-income family, kids can't just walk over to the refrigerator and take whatever they want out of it. Why? Because there might not be enough left for everybody.
Fuck, even for us.
Yeah, I know. Our kids are constantly doing that, despite the fact that we say, hey, stop doing that. Please talk to us before you take something out of the refrigerator.
Sure, but in a super wealthy household where the parents don't even have to do their own shopping, like the servants go out and shop for it, the kids can just walk up to the refrigerator, whatever they want, and go away, and no one cares, right? And that in a lot of ways, if the parents are both working 40-hour weeks, if they're struggling to pay the bills, you know, things, you know, it kind of necessitates a more rigid authoritarian environment. And you know, if the school has a lot of the problems that low-income schools have, you know, even if they're not straight up kidding the kids, there's a lot more police presence in the school. There's a lot more rules. There's going to be a dress code about, you know, gang colors or whatever. And
military recruiters will show up.
Yes, exactly. And it's going to be a much more rigid environment. And so, you know, the BreadTubers, a lot of them, you know, are from this kind of middle class, this cushy middle class layer of society. And they just get triggered by anything that reeks of authoritarianism. Right? And their opposition to Trump, and their opposition to China, and their opposition to Russia, and their opposition to Cuba and Nicaragua and North Korea, it's all based on this kind of like big, mean, scary people giving orders, right? And it's all the same, right? For them, it's more, you know, leftism is more about intellectual nonconformity.
Yeah.
Right. Yes.
Absolutely.
Oh my God.
Absolutely.
Same with the post-left. It's all about being contrarian.
Yeah.
Sure. I mean, and ultimately the road to liberating, and this is, you know, I've emphasized this before, but, you know, Jordan Peterson, he gets on there and he says, well, hierarchies are just natural. Lobsters have hierarchies, you know, et cetera.
Consider the lobster.
but the reality is that social hierarchies are rooted in scarcity.
Yes.
Absolutely.
Absolutely.
It's not intrinsic human nature. It's the fact that somebody doesn't have something that they need. It's that simple.
Yes, and the road to eliminating hierarchies is eliminating scarcity.
Mm-hmm. Yes. Mm-hmm. And so all this degrowth austerity shit.
And so, this is kind of what I wanted to communicate here. And this also applies to the socialist countries. If the Soviet Union hadn't been surrounded and under attack and invaded by 15 different countries, it wouldn't have become the rigid authoritarian place it became.
Absolutely.
And, if you think North Korea, do you think they want to be this, this militarized society that's locked down, that's had to proliferate nuclear weapons? Of course not.
Yeah, it's all about the haircut and the jumpsuit. Like, that's what the country is entirely about, to like the BreadTube elite type that you're talking about. It's literally like, this guy, he wants to enforce his own style on everyone.
Yeah, just, fashion authoritarianism there.
Always.
But it's like, this is the thing. And that, if socialism could really blossom into what it's meant to be, we could have a better time. And probably the most problematic thing in this synthetic left ideology is the idea that average people are the enemy, right?
Yeah,
really
100%.
The idea is that the average people are the mob, they're the rabble, they're dangerous, and that they need to be controlled. And so, there's a fear of mobilizing around economic issues, because that's populism, right? You're going to be mobilizing those rabble, and those dangerous rabble are going to be marching and making demands. And, Huey Long.
Tyranny of the masses.
Yeah, the tyranny of the masses.
Sure. Huey Long is this famous politician from Louisiana. And if you talk to anyone from Louisiana, people remember him as like a great hero of the working class. Huey Newton, the founder of the Black Panthers, is named after Huey Long. And why is that? Because the first Black nurses in Louisiana got hired because of Huey Long. And he talks about this in his autobiography. And that Huey Long enabled a lot of Black people to vote. He enabled voter registration for Black people to expand. He built highways and bridges all across the state. He provided school textbooks to the African-American segregated schools, which the right wing was furious about. Why are you giving textbooks to Black people? But Huey Long was a champion of the working people of Louisiana. And he was a champion of working people, both white and Black. And Louisiana, there's a lot of Catholics in Louisiana, but it's the South. And back then the Ku Klux Klan was very popular. And he rose to power as an enemy of the Ku Klux Klan, as an ally of the Roman Catholics and the Black people against the Klan in the Jim Crow South. So Huey Long was definitely a progressive. Now, his relationship with the Communist Party was complicated, but he was largely accused of being a communist and a socialist. He started the Share Our Wealth movement that was started. And he was considered to be, just somebody who fought for the working class and was ultimately assassinated. And it was the rich people who killed him. It was very clear. I mean, if you watch any documentary or read any book, people will tell you that among the rich neighborhoods in New Orleans, they were all saying it's about time for somebody to shoot that son of a bitch. He was considered to be a fighter for the working class. But in the Communist Party's hit piece on me, they bait me for supporting Huey Long because they consider Huey Long to be a fascist or a populist. Well, he was a populist, but populism shouldn't be a dirty word. It's not a dirty word to Huey Newton. It's not a dirty word to most African-American folks in Louisiana. And he was a fighter for the people. But if you look at the way Huey Long framed his arguments, it was very much, fighting for the common people, share our wealth. It wasn't a highfalutin intellectual thing about postmodernism and everyone can think what they want. It was, I'm going to be a tough authoritarian and fight for you. That was the message, right? I'm going to be your strong man against the rich and powerful. That was the message. And it has a whiff of authoritarianism in it that kind of triggers these BreadTube types.
Exactly.
The synthetic left in BreadTube is entirely antagonistic to populism, which is the only effective route to achieve it.
You have to appeal to people.
That's what we have to do. The goal is not to be king of socialism. We are never going to be king of socialism. Look, I mean, I don't want to name names here, but, I used to go to the Left Forum, right? The Left Forum is a great place, but I've noticed that the Left Forum is a really little pond. And if you have got a budget or a mainstream publisher behind you, you can be king of Left Forum very, very easily, right? And it's all about how much money you have. You know what I'm saying?
Absolutely.
And being the king of socialism, being the top socialist, is just a matter of getting the right book deal and getting the right social media promotion. And at the end of the day, we're never going to be able to whiz bang the ruling class, right? They created BreadTube, and BreadTube is going to be the top voice of socialism on the internet. Right, they put certain voices out there, and they're the books at Barnes and Noble you find on socialism. The ruling class knows what they're doing. Okay,
absolutely.
The way that socialists historically have been successful is by getting to average people, getting to the broad masses of people, and building organizations among them to fight for their rights. That's how you do it. It's not through taking over academia. It's not through taking over the activist circle and being the most sexy, revolutionary looking. That's not how it works. It's about getting lower and deeper to the real masses. And
absolutely.
That's what we need to do. That's what we need to do. And that too much of the left material is focusing inward. Right. And that I will actually often go out of my way to say things that I know are not popular with socialists, because I'm done trying to win over socialists to like me. I'm trying to build a mass movement that could actually win over the broad masses of Americans. Right. I mean, I'd like socialists to like me. That's great. But I would prefer that people who aren't socialists become socialists. The way
Bingo.
that, when I got interested in communism when I was a kid, right. No one in my family was a communist. Nobody in my town was a communist. I had to get on the internet, which was a new invention then. And I was shocked to learn there was a communist party in the United States, let alone there were 15 or 20 or 100 communist parties. And I had to track down these groups it was they weren't in my face, right? That's not, most people my age, that's their story. They got interested in communism because they learned about it in school. And then they thought, well, I wonder if there's anybody who still believes in it. And then they went and did all kinds of research to actually track down communists and found them. And often they're quite disappointed with what they find. You know what I mean? They find something and they're like, oh, okay, well, if I want to be a communist, this is what I got to do. And that's kind of how it works. But
campaign for my local Democrats.
Yeah. Or sell Bobavakian's newspaper or whatever.
Or subscribe to the idea that I'm not supposed to have anything at all. And
this isn't how, nobody in China in the 1930s was I wonder if there's anyone who believes in communism in China. And went and looked up and said, oh, there's this guy Mao. I'm going to go check out his books. That's not how it worked. The way people got into communism in China was they were starving villagers and they were fighting for their rights against landlords. And then there was this big, huge political organization that said, we're on your side and we have your back. And they found out that this big, huge political organization believed in communism, and they learned it, right? And in the 1930s, in the United States, nobody joined the Communist Party because they read about communism someplace. It seemed interesting. They went, they were in a neighborhood, they were in a factory, and there was people organizing the union, and they happened to be in the Communist Party. This is how our ideas work, right? And until we get into the mode of going lower and deeper to the real masses and not being this kind of circle of intellectual intrigue, which is kind of like what we are right now. Look, in a lot of ways, being a communist in the United States, it's getting a little different now because politics is getting so intense, right? Things have changed a little bit. But for the most part, especially in the 90s, being a communist in the United States, you might as well be into Aleister Crowley. You might as well be into Esperanto, the universal language. Maybe you're into UFOs. It was just, there was a lot of little niche, absurd interests that one could have. And communism was one of those.
Oh, yeah. I remember very distinctly in the 1990s, this game called Command and Conquer Red Alert. Did you ever see that video game?
No, I didn't.
I have infantile amnesia for that period because my brain wasn't fully there yet.
No, it was a real-time strategy game.
I was working on my fine motor skills.
Yeah. I wasn't. I was playing this real-time strategy game. It was a real-time strategy game that actually starred Tim Curry as a communist. And it was totally absurd. It was intended to be funny, and it is very funny. But, that was probably my actual first exposure to communism. And it didn't treat it in a way that was a serious political affiliation, but rather sort of a novelty.
So you didn't listen in school at all?
Oh, no. Well, the way that school treated communism for me was more along the lines of, this is a thing that just fell apart completely.
Well, yeah.
a year ago.
Also, holy shit. Yeah. Wow. I was not thinking about that. You were literally in school when that. Wow.
Yeah.
You're 100.
Yeah, I literally had to reprogram my mind to not know it as the USSR anymore.
That's so
weird. Up here, isn't
Peter
it?
Who's the oldest, and then I'm like middle, and then Miss Astronaut Cowboy is the youngest, right?
Yeah. Smart though. Very smart though.
The Seinfeld episode. I don't know. Do you ever see the Seinfeld episode about the communist?
You probably have.
I feel like yes, but it's been a long time. I haven't seen most Seinfeld since probably the late 90s.
Elaine starts dating this guy who wears like a hat with a visor on it, and he's just kind of socially awkward. And then she finds like a communist newspaper at his house, and she
right.
Is he a communist or something? And they're like, does he dress really drab and his clothes are really? Yeah, well, definitely he's a communist or something like that.
Yeah, I remember that. He was the secret communist. That's what it was.
And it's just this like, it's like this. I mean, and that's really what being a communist in like the 90s was. It was like, was this now things are a little bit different with the right wing always calling, first they called Obama a communist, and now there's this whole thing with BreadTube. And so there's more people interested in it now because of like divisions in the ruling class and stuff. But among like the BreadTubers, it's still seen as this expression of like counterculture, right? It's this expression of like, I'm going to go against US society and be really edgy. And it's like, again, it's in the same category as occult mysticism, as psychoanalysis, as, hypnosis. I don't know what else. UFOs, people who might go hiking in the mountains of Nepal for a year or something. It's like, it's in that category.
Professor saying, don't call me doctor. I'm not into hierarchies.
Yeah.
Right. And it's in a lot of ways, I mean, I'll be real. In a lot of ways, communism is kind of a rich kid hobby, and that's what always put me off. I mean, there was a group that used to be around called the ISO, the International Socialist Organization. I think they merged into DSA recently after some sexual assault scandals or something. But I used to hate them because it was very wealthy kids from like Harvard and Yale, and they dressed really fancy, and they were just the snobbery. I mean, and a lot of people just had the same experience. If you were a working class person who couldn't afford to like pay $500 plus all your meals and housing when you'd go to their conference every year, you couldn't, dish out the cash. They didn't want you, and it was very much a rich kids club. And it was just this kind of like hobby for rich kids. And in a lot of ways, it was just this kind of, and the other thing that also I've noticed about this is it was considered to be like a college phase. Have you ever heard that? And I would always hear people quote to me, well, if you're not a communist when you're 20, you have no heart. But if you're still a communist when you're 40, you have no brain.
Yeah. And
I like to use that for anarchism, though.
Well, there you go. It was a lot of these groups, in a way, it was like you'd be at Harvard or Yale or Case Western Reserve University in Cleveland or something like that. And you're young and you're kind of an intellectual and you study these ideas. So you join one of these little groups and you sell their newspaper. And after about a year or two, you realize this group is never really going to grow. It's never going to be part mainstream current. And then, you go back to graduate school and move on with your life, right? And that's kind of, Gen X, post-1960s, that's what being a communist really was. And so, when I would go out and sell newspapers, I would often get really kind of snide responses from people because they were used to that. It's like, give it 2 years, you'll grow up out of this, the revolution won't come, and they weren't wrong because that's what happened with communism in this kind of late Cold War normal, where it was kind of this middle class phase. But that's because we're not out of the movement and to the masses. We're not going lower and deeper to the real masses. We're still in this kind of, I don't even know what you want to call it, this cosmopolitan, bohemian, it's whatever that is, right? And that's what we need to get away from.
In terms of like people who actually are publicly known for talking about communism, you and I are actually fairly different from what is. We're both from small towns in the Midwest. I didn't actually finish college. I went into community college on a Pell Grant, and I did not finish it.
You could have been on Kamala Harris's thing.
I could have. Other than being white.
It sounds like what you grew out of, Caleb, was not communism, but this sort of synthetic left Congress for Cultural Freedom infiltration of communism in favor of an actual Marxist analysis.
I mean, I remember when I was in these communist groups, I would be like, is anybody normal? Like that was, I was in a communist current, and it was a lot of very smart people and group of high achieving people. I worked with Leslie Feinberg, who was the first openly trans activist in the United States, and I worked with another guy who was like a mathematics genius, right? He had no college degree, but he became like the sports statistician for the New York Knicks. And he was also the only person in New York City history to be arrested for owning a live alligator, Yeah,
that's the best sounding stuff. I want to know more about this man, but not really.
Right. He ended up getting kicked out of the group I was in because he wrote a book about physics that they didn't agree with, so they expelled him. It was just like ridiculous.
What the fuck?
Yeah, I mean,
that's dumb.
Yeah, and like there was somebody else who like their cousin was a very famous, like you would know the name, a Hollywood film director. There's somebody else whose like relative was like, whose father was like a famous, TV personality that I would also, if I name, and it was like there was nobody who was like a normal person. Right. And that was what I was thinking. I was like, we need average people in Kansas and Idaho and North Carolina and South Carolina and California. We need just average American families to say, you know what, communism's right for us. And when I would say things like that, people would just look at me like, why would they do that? Like, why would we ever try to appeal to those people?
Yeah, it's not right for them. They hate everyone.
Yeah.
Yeah. And it's like, so you really want to have a revolution? You want to take power? But it's like the idea of reaching average people is this like absurd, like crazy idea.
Right. To have people support communism is like a negative thing.
Yeah. Right. And then there was this kind of, they were like out of touch. And I noticed that too. I mean, people would say things to me that I could just tell these people had never really been in the real world. You know what I'm saying?
Yeah.
They've always been in this milieu. I had someone tell me that, I'm from Ohio, and someone told me once that everyone in Ohio believes that Jews have horns and tails and are born with horns and tails. And I said to them, I am from Ohio, and I can tell you I have never met anyone in my entire life who thinks that Jews are born with horns and tails. Never.
Well,
but they swore, no, this is what people think. They know it. They've talked to people. And it's like, no, I mean, go outside of Greenwich Village for a few days, please. And then, of course, then there's an angle that you can go from, which then it kind of turns into this weird white savior complex.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
And that gets even weirder. It's kind of the belief that average white people, if they're socially conservative, they're the Ku Klux Klan, they're satanic, right? If a white person comes around and says they don't believe in gay marriage, well, they need to be banned, get away from me, fascist, But if a black person comes around and says, well, I'm a Christian, I don't believe in gay marriage, there's this opposite, like condescending attitude. Of course you think that.
Yeah. And it's dehumanizing to people of color to not treat that idea the same way.
Exactly.
Right. Yeah. It's like, no, you should be able to talk to a white person or a black person about why you personally support gay marriage. Right.
100%.
And you should just dismiss the white person who is opposed to gay marriage. And you shouldn't have a condescending, disrespectful attitude toward the black person who dismisses it.
Where you can't critically engage with them.
I mean, when I posted, for example, that I was willing to work with people opposed to abortion and gay marriage, I immediately got a lot of people saying, of course, a white male would say that. I wasn't necessarily even talking about white people. The Nation of Islam is opposed to abortion and gay marriage, and they are not a white organization. I'll tell you that much. I risked my life on a ship to Yemen with a group of Iranian doctors and Iranian members of parliament, and they were all very opposed to abortion and gay marriage, and they were not white. I'll tell you that much. I mean, it's just like, but it's this belief that like conservatives are white and people of color.
Like, what they think in their core is that people of color aren't smart enough to critically engage.
Yeah, it is a secret racism that is somehow like good.
And it's so true. Like thinking of conservative ideology as a strictly white thing. I mean, as someone growing up in a very Catholic, very Hispanic community with mostly people of color, it's like, this is not a white exclusive issue. Like the people that I was around, do you want to hear their views about abortion? Like the Hispanic communities in the Catholic Church, you think they support gay marriage and abortion rights? It's like, no.
Yeah, I mean, social conservatism tends to be prominent among working class people wherever you go in the world.
Especially religious people.
Yeah. Yeah, and that's, I mean, and that more middle class people tend to be more socially liberal. That's not an endorsement
and less religious.
Conservatism.
Yeah.
That's just a fact. And this middle class strata, they kind of live in a delusion about that. And I think that's weird. And because the memo has gone out that now we're having this woke makeover of U.S. society, now it's like, well, people of color are just innocent victims, so we're not going to acknowledge they have any socially conservative views, but we're going to associate socially conservative views with
it's just papering over the material reality.
And the main thing is, we have not really, as a movement, talked about the fall of the Soviet Union. And we need to talk about it, right? The Soviet Union fell. Socialism has changed. The Soviet Union's never coming back. And that's a conversation that the socialist movement really needs to have. And part of the reason I think there's so much, BreadTube is out there is, at the end of the day, those of us who believe in socialism, we don't know what we believe. You see the average, you go to a protest, you'll see some old communist selling a newspaper, point at them and say, what is Venezuela? And you won't get an answer. Or if you do, it'll be a wacky answer that you won't like, right? That we as a movement, the international communist movement around the world is having these conversations. In China, they're having these conversations. Latin America, they're having these conversations. But the U.S. Marxist left is not having these conversations. We need to update our ideology. We need to talk about what happened. What happened with the fall of the Soviet Union? Why was it that this happened? And a lot of documents are coming out in Chinese about this. A lot of documents have been published in Latin America. Whole volumes of books have been written. But we need to talk about it as a group. So I'm glad I was able to contribute, some of my observations about this.
Caleb, thank you so much for this. This was just fantastic. Anything you want to plug before we head out?
Well, sure. Well, now that my BreadTube book is validated, you can still get a copy of it. So.
You should very much get a copy of this book.
Good.